It's that time of year again. No, I'm not talking about spring or March Madness. I'm talking about the annual conversation about whether or not the superiority of the University of Connecticut's women's basketball team is actually somehow bad for the women's game. Like clockwork, this yearly debate pushes us further and further away from any productive conversation about the state of women's basketball, just as its season reaches its peak. It is, in essence, a trap. And it's one that we keep getting stuck in, over and over again. Hence, this article, with women's basketball, it's always the same jokes. Elizabeth Williams, a WNBA All-Star center for the Atlanta Dream and former basketball star at Duke, told Think Progress. These media outlets, they know better. Why write an article about something you don't know about? It's so frustrating. Molly Yanity, an assistant professor of journalism at Quinnipiac and former sports reporter, actually thinks that might be the problem, how much these media outlets don't know about the sport upon which they keep rendering the same judgment. What gets under my skin about this is that the people who try to make this argument don't know about the history of women's sports and media in the United States, Yanity said. This year's edition of The Conversation began with UConn's historic 140-52 thrashing of St. Francis University, who drew the unenviable challenge of taking on the Huskies in the first round of the NCAA tournament. The game ended in a rout that rewrote the record books. Yet instead of marveling at UConn's achievement, Josh Peters of USA Today took his analysis in another direction, explicitly calling their win a loss for women's basketball. I could stop here and point out that, while this margin of victory was excessive, there is nothing particularly notable or alarming about it. No. 1 seed blowing out a number 16 seed. I could also mention that it makes perfect sense that UConn was extra dialed in during that game, given it was their first NCAA tournament game since being upset by Mississippi State in the Final Four last year. What's more, according to reports, the UConn women had the opportunity to watch the Virginia men's basketball team lose in the first round to UMBC, their lightly regarded 16th seed opponents. Watching history unfold in the men's bracket in an online group chat, the UConn women pledged that it wouldn't happen to them. But these logical facts are merely a digression where this conversation is concerned. The women's NCAA tournament should be far more than an afterthought. Peters' article elicited a response from economist David Berry, who argued in an article for Forbes that it's not a lack of competitiveness that's hurting women's basketball, it's a lack of media coverage. Then, Berry's article spurred a take from Jason Lisk of the Big League, who took particular offense to Berry's assertion that the lack of women in sports media has an impact on the lack of coverage for women's basketball. This seems to put the issue on the male-dominated sports media. If only the dang media would talk about women's basketball more, people would be interested and watch. Lisk writes in his article, which carried the title "The number of men in sports media is not the issue with women's college basketball interest, the more likely causation flows the other way. The consumer interest is relatively low in news articles and analysis of women's basketball, and thus there is less coverage. Are you even following this? UConn is really good at women's basketball, which is bad for women's basketball, and nobody covers women's basketball, but only because nobody cares about women's basketball, because women's basketball is bad, unless UConn is playing, in which case they're so good that it's all bad again. Oh, and none of this is the fault of the patriarchy. It's simple, really. There's a complete disconnect between the criticism and the reality. UConn is actually the reason a lot of fans do pay attention to women's basketball. Williams said. Nobody talks about how bad Golden State is for men's basketball. It's such a double standard. The most frustrating part about this predictable conversation, besides its awesomely asinine premises, that is the way it splits the public into two clear camps, those who hate women's basketball and think it's ridiculous to think that anyone could ever enjoy it, and those who will defend it at all costs. The gap between those camps. There lies the trap. That's where this conversation gets stuck. Why write an article about something you don't know about? It's so frustrating. First of all, let's state for the record that there are many men who provide excellent coverage of women's basketball, and women in sports media should not be exclusively tasked with covering women's sports. But of course the lack of women in sports media is part of this problem. 90% of sports editors are male. 90%. And if those men truly don't carry any bias into their work, as Lisk suggests, they're doing a very poor job of showing it. Last year, Think Progress compared the coverage discrepancy between the men's and women's basketball tournament on ESPN and the NCAA's website. The results were staggering. It found that on the NCAA website, men's basketball was 3 times as likely as women's basketball to be the lead image on the home page, and more than twice as likely to be featured in the top headlines. On the ESPN homepage, the men's tournament was 9 times as likely to land a featured spot at the top of the website, and almost 3 times as likely to be featured on the front page as a whole. And, for the 57 ESPN television shows that Think Progress reviewed, 27 episodes didn't mention women's college basketball once. Only 12 episodes didn't include a single segment about men's college basketball. Even the NCAA's own website shows a stark gender bias. Think Progress specifically picked ESPN and the NCAA's website because both of those entities should have, in theory, been invested in covering the women's basketball tournament, since it was an NCAA event and ESPN had the exclusive television rights. CBS airs the men's tournament. The results were not particularly surprising. 3 years ago, a study found that ESPN's SportsCenter only dedicated 2%